In the unforgiving Arizona desert of 1885, a former cavalry officer who defied orders to protect innocent lives finds himself at the mercy of an all-female tribe led by a woman harboring the deadliest secret in the territory. When the past comes hunting with an army behind it, survival means choosing between duty and love, between the man he was and the protector he was meant to become. Hit that like button and subscribe for more epic Western tales where honor collides with heart in ways that will leave you breathless. Lost cavalry officer rescued by warrior women, but her father wants them all dead. The sun was a merciless eye watching Ethan Cross struggle against the desert that had already decided to claim him. 3 days without water had stripped away everything except the stubborn refusal to die that had kept him breathing through worse hells than this one. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Porter, who'd carried him across half of Arizona territory, had collapsed yesterday morning, or maybe it was the day before. Time moved differently when death was measuring your steps, when each breath came harder than the last, and mirages danced on the horizon like promises the desert never intended to keep. The irony wasn't lost on him, even through the haze of dehydration and approaching delirium. After surviving Gettysburg, where Confederate grape shot had torn through his regiment like wheat before a scythe, after walking away from a military career, rather than slaughter innocent Apache families at Canyon de Chelly, after 2 years of drifting through territories where his name still carried weight he didn't want, the desert was going to finish what human bullets couldn't. Ethan had always prided himself on reading the land, on understanding the subtle signs that separated survival from death in the wilderness. He'd guided cavalry patrols through hostile territory, tracked raiders across badlands that had swallowed better men than him, navigated by stars when landmarks failed. That knowledge had kept him alive through the war, and the wandering years after had given him the confidence to strike out alone when most men traveled in groups. But the desert didn't care about his experience or his pride. It was older than human ambition, vaster than human understanding, and it had patience that made human lifespans seem like moments between heartbeats. The dust storm had appeared on the horizon, like the wrath of some ancient god, a wall of sand and stone that swallowed the sky from east to west. Ethan had seen storms before, the sudden squalls that could blind a man for hours, the whirlwinds that could lift a horse off its feet, but nothing like this. This was the desert taking back what belonged to it, erasing the tracks of foolish men who thought they could cross its domain without permission. He tried to outrun it, pushing Porter harder than he should have, looking for shelter that didn't exist in this flat expanse of hardpan and scattered sage. But the storm moved with the weight of divine wrath, closing the distance between them like a living thing that could taste his fear and found it wanting. When the wind hit, it didn't just move air, it moved the world. Day became night in the space of a heartbeat, the sun disappearing behind walls of churning debris that turned the familiar landscape into an alien hell. Every landmark Ethan had memorized: the distinctive red rock formation to the north, the line of cottonwoods that marked a seasonal creek. The distant mountains that had guided his direction disappeared behind curtains of stinging sand that scoured exposed skin and filled lungs with grit. He'd wrapped his shirt around his face, leaving his torso bare to the elements, and tried to keep moving, but direction became meaningless when you couldn't see your own hands stretched out in front of your face. The wind howled with voices that might have been human, might have been something else entirely, and the sand struck his skin like needles driven by malevolent intent. Porter had gone down first, the faithful horse finally succumbing to 3 days without proper water and the additional stress of fighting through the storm. Ethan had tried to shelter against the animal's bulk, but the wind found him anyway, driving sand into every fold of clothing, every crack of exposed skin, until he felt like he was being buried alive while still breathing. The storm lasted hours or minutes, impossible to tell which when time became as fluid as the shifting dunes around him. When it finally passed, moving on to terrorize some other piece of creation, Ethan found himself in a landscape that looked nothing like the one he'd entered. The desert had rearranged itself with the casual indifference of a child playing with blocks, creating new hills and valleys bearing familiar rocks under dunes that hadn't existed that morning. He was lost in a way that went deeper than direction, deeper than the simple failure of navigation. This was existential lostness, the kind that preceded not just death, but the complete erasure of identity. Out here, stripped of context and civilization and the landmarks that defined human space, A man became just another collection of bones, waiting to be polished clean by wind and time. Ethan had tried to salvage what he could from Porter's body. The water in his canteens had lasted less than a day in the desert heat, but there were other supplies that might buy him a few more hours of life. His rifle wrapped in oilcloth and miraculously undamaged. A small amount of jerky that would only make his thirst worse. A compass that spun uselessly because every direction looked the same when you were surrounded by infinite emptiness. He'd picked a direction south because south might eventually lead to the Mexican border and settlements along the Rio Grande, and started walking. Each step became an act of defiance against the desert's patient certainty that he would join the countless other men whose bones lay scattered beneath the sand. He walked through the heat of the afternoon as the sun transformed the air itself into something that shimmered and danced and played tricks on dying minds. By the time his legs gave out, the sun had moved past its zenith and was beginning its descent toward another horizon Ethan was increasingly certain he would never see. His lips were cracked leather, his tongue swollen to twice its normal size, his throat a column of fire that made swallowing impossible, even if he'd had something to swallow. He lay in sand still warm from the day's heat and stared at stars beginning to appear in the deepening blue, each point of light a reminder of how vast and indifferent the universe was to human suffering. If this was how it ended, at least it was honest. No glory, no heroism, just a man who'd made choices and lived with consequences until he couldn't anymore. There was something almost peaceful about it, this final surrender to forces larger than pride or will, or the stubborn determination that had carried him through everything else. The desert would take him, and in taking him would erase all the mistakes and failures and moments of moral compromise that had driven him to this place of final reckoning. Consciousness faded like water, disappearing into sand. And for a time, Ethan Cross ceased to exist as anything more than another piece of the landscape waiting to be reclaimed. When awareness returned, it came wrapped in the sound of voices speaking a language that danced at the edge of understanding. Ethan's first coherent thought was that dying was more complicated than he'd expected. His second thought was that hell had surprisingly good rope quality. The bindings around his wrists were expertly tied tight enough to hold, but positioned to avoid cutting off circulation entirely. Professional work. His shoulders screamed from being pulled back at an unnatural angle, and when he tried to move his legs, he discovered his ankles were bound too. The sand beneath him was still cool, which meant dawn or dusk. Given the voices and the fact that he was apparently still breathing, someone had found him before the desert could finish its work. Ethan forced his eyes open and immediately regretted it. 8 women stood in a semicircle around him, and every single one looked capable of killing him with whatever weapon she happened to be holding. These weren't town women or settlers. These were warriors, their leather clothing darkened by sun, and used their hair long and unbound, except for beaded bands across their foreheads. They moved with the fluid confidence of people who'd been born dangerous, and they were staring at him with expressions he couldn't quite read. Not curiosity, not hunger, something colder. Assessment. Ethan's throat felt like it was lined with broken glass, but he tried to speak anyway. The sound that came out was barely human. One of the women, younger than the others, with a scar cutting through her left eyebrow, said something sharp in their language. Another answered her tone, equally heated. An argument started, quick and passionate hands moving in gestures that clearly involved him and his immediate future. Then the group parted. The woman who walked through them didn't need to announce her authority. It radiated from her like heat from stone. She wore a full headdress, eagle feathers spreading behind her head in a crown of white and brown. Turquoise and silver adorned her arms and the throat, but it was her face that made Ethan's breath catch in his damaged throat. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with softness. Sharp cheekbones, dark eyes that seemed to catalog everything in a single glance, lips pressed into a line that suggested she'd forgotten how to smile years ago. But there was something else, an exhaustion that lived in her bones, the look of someone who'd been carrying impossible weight for too long. She stopped 3 feet in front of him and studied him the way someone might study a horse at auction, checking for defects, calculating value. Ethan tried to straighten despite the ropes tried to meet her gaze with something resembling dignity. She noticed the effort. One corner of her mouth twitched, but it wasn't quite amusement. When she finally spoke, her English was precise, barely touched by accent. "You were dying. We brought you water, kept you breathing. You're welcome." Ethan's voice cracked when he answered. Funny way of showing gratitude. The ropes seem excessive. The ropes are necessary. She tilted her head slightly still, watching him. Men who wake in unfamiliar places do unpredictable things. We prefer predictability. Ethan glanced at the other women, then back at her. Where are your men? Something flickered across her expression, too fast to name. We don't have men. Not anymore. The words hung in the air, strange and impossible. Ethan's mind tried to work through the logistics of what she was saying and came up empty. A tribe of only women didn't make sense. Nothing about this made sense. The woman took a step closer, close enough that Ethan could see the beadwork on her headdress was intricate, traditional, the kind of craftsmanship that took months. Close enough to see that her eyes weren't just dark, they were exhausted. She looked like someone who'd stopped sleeping years ago. My name is Kaya, she said quietly, and I need your help. Help with what? Kaya's expression didn't change, but something in the set of her shoulders suggested she was bracing herself for his reaction. I need you to give me an heir. The words didn't register at first. They were too absurd, too disconnected from reality. Ethan stared at her, waiting for the punchline, the clarification, anything that would make the sentence make sense. But Kaya just stood there, watching him process it, her face carved from stone. Behind her, the other women had gone, still waiting. Ethan's laugh came out, harsh and disbelieving. You're insane. I'm practical. You can't just... He pulled against the ropes, felt them bite deeper into his wrists. You can't keep a man prisoner and expect him to... This is madness. This is survival. Kaya's voice remained level, almost bored, as if they were discussing weather patterns. My tribe is dying. We have no men, no way to continue our bloodline. You appeared in our territory alone, with no one who will come looking for you. It's not madness, it's opportunity. The casual way she said it made Ethan's stomach turn. He looked past her at the other women, searching for any sign of hesitation, any hint that this was some kind of test or joke. But their faces showed nothing. They'd heard this speech before. They'd already decided. There are towns, Ethan said, forcing his voice steady. Trading posts. You could find willing men. You don't need to... We do. Kaya cut him off. We can't go to towns. We can't be seen. Our survival depends on remaining hidden from the world that destroyed us. She paused, and for just a moment, something raw flickered behind her eyes. We take what the desert brings us. And it brought you. The woman with the scarred eyebrow said something sharp in their language. Kaya answered without looking away from Ethan, her tone firm. The scarred woman pressed her point, gesturing at him, clearly arguing. Kaya's response was short and final. The woman fell silent, but her expression promised this conversation wasn't over. Kaya turned back to Ethan. Nadi thinks we should just take what we need and leave you for the vultures after. She doesn't believe in unnecessary mercy. Kaya took another step closer, close enough that Ethan could smell sage and smoke on her clothes. I convinced them to offer you a chance to cooperate, to be treated with dignity instead of like livestock. But my patience has limits. She crouched down, bringing her eyes level with his. This close, Ethan could see the fine lines around her eyes, the way her jaw muscles were clenched tight, the barely contained exhaustion that lived in her bones. She looked like someone who'd been at war so long, she'd forgotten peace was possible. You have until morning to decide, Kaya said quietly. Cooperate and live as one of us. Refuse and die free in the sand. She reached out and Ethan flinched involuntarily, but she only brushed dust from his shoulder, her touch impersonal, clinical. Choose wisely, Ethan Cross. The desert doesn't offer second chances. The sound of his own name from her lips was like a physical blow. How do you... But Kaya was already standing, already walking away, her warriors following. Only two remained behind, standing guard. They didn't look at him, didn't speak, just watched the horizon while Ethan sat in the sand, his wrists burning, his mind spinning through impossible options. And somewhere in the camp behind him, he heard the sound of women's voices, low and rhythmic, singing. Something that sounded like prayer or prophecy, or both. Night fell with the sudden finality of a curtain drop, and nobody came to untie Ethan. His shoulders had gone from burning to numb, which somehow felt worse. He could see the camp now spread out in a natural depression between two rock formations that would make it invisible from any distance. 15, maybe 20 structures made of hide and wood and arranged in a loose circle around a central fire pit. Efficient, defensible. These women knew what they were doing. He counted them as they moved through Camp 18 total. The youngest looked barely 16, the oldest, perhaps 50. All of them moved with purpose, no wasted motion. They weren't playing at being warriors. They were warriors, the kind forged by necessity rather than choice. Ethan watched them prepare the evening meal, tend to weapons, check supplies. Normal camp activities, except there was nothing normal about a camp with no men, no children, except his breath caught. There, helping an older woman organize something near the fire, was a little girl, maybe 6 years old, with dark hair in 2 braids and clothing that matched the women around her in miniature. One child. In a camp of 18 women, one child. The arithmetic was brutal and clear. Whatever had happened to this tribe, it had been recent enough that children hadn't grown yet, or catastrophic enough that none had survived. Except one. The woman with the scarred eyebrow Nadi approached with a canteen. She didn't ask permission before grabbing his jaw and forcing water past his lips. Half of it spilled down his chin. She didn't seem to care. When the canteen was empty, she dropped it in the sand and walked away without a word. Charming, Ethan muttered. She lost her husband and both brothers. The voice came from his left. An older woman emerged from the shadows, moving with the careful precision of someone whose joints protested every step. Her hair was streaked with gray, her face lined with decades of sun and hardship, but her eyes were sharp and missed nothing. You remind her of what she lost. She would prefer you dead. Can't imagine why I'm not winning hearts, Ethan said. The woman lowered herself to the ground with a soft grunt, sitting just outside his reach. My name is Sahali. I am the one who argued against keeping you alive. Appreciate the honesty. Honesty is all we have left. Sahali studied him with those sharp eyes. You're wondering what happened to our men. It wasn't a question. Ethan said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. Raiders came 3 seasons ago. Sahali continued, her voice flat, stripped of emotion by repetition. They wanted our horses, our supplies, our land. Our men fought them off, but the raiders came back, with more men, and more, and more. She paused. By the time it ended, every man we had was gone, killed defending us, and we were left with a choice: scatter and die, slowly absorbed into settlements that would never accept us, or stay together and find another way to survive. So you decided to kidnap men from the desert. You're the first. Sahali's mouth twitched in something that might have been amusement. We've been searching for 3 years. Most men who cross this territory travel in groups or stay on established trails where we can't risk being seen. You're the first fool stupid enough to ride alone through the deep desert. The words stung because they were true. Ethan had been proud of his ability to navigate alone, to trust himself above all others. That pride had led him here, bound and trapped and facing a choice no man should have to make. Kaya could have her pick of willing men in any town, Ethan said. Why this? Why force it? Sahali looked at him for a long moment. Because if we go to towns, we cease to exist. We become their women, their servants, their property. We lose everything our mothers and grandmothers built. This way we survive on our terms. She stood slowly. Kaya believes you're different. She thinks she sees something worth keeping. I think she's desperate and making dangerous decisions. Sahali started to walk away, then paused. Prove me wrong or prove me right, but decide quickly. Desperate women make poor captors. Eventually they become something worse. She disappeared into the darkness, leaving Ethan alone with 2 silent guards and 1,000 burning questions. In the distance, Kaya stood near the central fire, her headdress removed, her long black hair catching firelight. She was looking directly at him across the camp, her expression unreadable. And Ethan realized that whether he agreed or refused, he was already part of something he didn't fully understand. Something that wouldn't let him go easily. Morning came with the sound of a child crying. Ethan had dozed fitfully, his body finding brief moments of unconsciousness despite the ropes in the impossible situation. But the sound of distress cut through his exhaustion like a blade, bringing him fully awake. Near the corral, the little girl he'd seen the night before was standing too close to one of the horses, her small hands pressed against the wooden fence. The animal, a paint mare with wild eyes, was clearly spooked. ears pinned back, nostrils flaring. The child was trying to climb through the fence. Ethan's heart kicked against his ribs. He'd worked with horses enough to know the signs this animal was about to bolt or strike, and that little girl was directly in the danger zone. One kick could kill her. "Hey!" Ethan shouted, his voice still rough from dehydration. "Get away from there!" But the child didn't understand English or was too focused on whatever had drawn her to the corral to hear him. She had one leg through the fence, now reaching toward the increasingly agitated horse. Ethan pulled against his bonds, feeling the ropes bite deep into his wrists. Blood ran down his hands, but the bindings held. Around the camp, women were starting to notice the situation, voices rising in alarm, but they were too far away to reach the child in time. The horse reared. Desperation gave Ethan strength he didn't know he possessed. He rolled, twisted, brought his bound hands around in front of his body, and worked frantically at the nos with his teeth. The rope was thick, well tied, but panic and determination made him savage. The child was halfway through the fence, now completely vulnerable. One of the knots loosened, then another. Ethan's hands came free just as the horse's hooves crashed down inches from where the little girl had been standing. She'd pulled back at the last second more by instinct than understanding, but she was still in danger. Ethan vaulted the fence, placing himself between the child and the animal. His voice dropped into the low, calm tone that every good horseman learned, the voice that spoke to something deeper than fear or anger. "Easy, girl, easy now." The horse snorted, stamping, but didn't bolt. Ethan kept talking, kept his movements slow and deliberate until the animal's ears flicked forward and the tension left its muscles. Only then did he scoop up the terrified child and carry her back to safety. A woman rushed forward, tears streaming, taking the girl from Ethan's arms with desperate gratitude. She spoke rapidly in her language, clutching her daughter, looking between Ethan and the approaching figures of Kaya and several other women with an expression somewhere between shock and relief. Kaya reached them first, her face unreadable. She spoke to the mother in their language, her tone gentle, then turned to Ethan. "Dakota is thanking you," Kaya translated. "That's her only child. The last one born before the raids." Ethan looked at the little girl, maybe 6 years old, clinging to her mother. The last child. He thought of what Sahali had said 3 years since the men died. That meant this girl was likely the youngest person in the entire camp. No babies, no toddlers, no future unless something changed. The weight of what Kaya had been trying to tell him finally settled in his chest. This wasn't abstract. This wasn't philosophical. These women weren't trying to trap him out of cruelty. They were watching their entire world die, one generation at a time. Kaya stood beside him, so close their shoulders almost touched. "Now do you understand?" Ethan watched the mother carry her daughter away, watched the other women return to their work with heavy expressions. The little girl looked back over her mother's shoulder, her dark eyes meeting his for just a moment. "Yeah," Ethan said quietly. "I'm starting to." That evening, Kaya invited Ethan to eat with the Council of Elders. 5 women sat around a small fire outside Sahali's dwelling, their faces carved by years and loss. They didn't hide their scrutiny. Every movement Ethan made was cataloged, judged, weighed against whatever standards they'd developed for evaluating the man who might determine their tribe's future. Sahali passed him dried meat and something that looked like flatbread. The food was simple but nourishing, prepared with the efficiency of people who understood the value of every calorie. "You saved Imala's life today," said the woman to Sahali's left, her English heavily accented but clear. "Many men would have let the child learn a hard lesson. You risked the horse's hooves without hesitation." Ethan shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I've worked with horses most of my life. It wasn't bravery, just reflex." "Reflex reveals character," Sahali said quietly. "You can lie with words. Your body tells the truth." They ate in silence for a while. Ethan could feel questions building in the air, unspoken but pressing. Finally, Kaya broke the quiet. "Tell us about your life before the desert." It was a simple question, but the answer wasn't. Ethan chewed slowly, considering. "Not much to tell. Worked ranches from Texas to Colorado. Never stayed anywhere long. Preferred moving to settling." "Why?" Kaya asked. The question was simple, but the answer wasn't. Ethan stared into the fire, trying to find words for something he'd never fully examined himself. "Guess I was running from something I couldn't name. Every place started feeling empty after a while, like I was waiting for something that never showed up." And now, Kaya's voice was soft. Does this place feel empty? Ethan met her eyes across the fire. No, it feels the opposite. Too full, too heavy. Like there's more meaning here than I know what to do with. Something passed between them in that moment, recognition maybe. Two people who'd been running from different things suddenly stopped in the same impossible place. One of the elders said something in their language. Sahali nodded and turned to Ethan. She says you have sad eyes, the eyes of someone who's been alone too long. Probably accurate, Ethan admitted. Kaya stood abruptly. Walk with me. It wasn't a request. Ethan followed her away from the fire past the edge of camp to where the desert stretched endless under stars so bright they looked painted. The night air was cold after the day's heat. Kaya wrapped her arms around herself, and for the first time, she looked small, uncertain. I need you to understand something, she said, not looking at him. What I'm asking of you isn't just about an heir, it's about hope. These women have been watching their world die for 3 years. Every morning they wake up knowing we're one step closer to extinction. They need to believe that tomorrow can be different than today. That's a lot of pressure to put on a stranger. It is. Kaya finally turned to face him. But you're not feeling like a stranger anymore. Not to me. The admission caught Ethan off guard. Kaya's defenses had been impenetrable since the moment he'd woken bound in the sand. Now they were cracking, showing the woman underneath the crown and the burden. I watched everyone I loved die. Kaya continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I held my mother while she bled out from wounds she took defending me. I burned my sister's body because there was no one else left to do it. And every day since then, I've had to be strong, had to be certain, had to convince everyone that I knew what I was doing. Her hands were shaking now. But I don't. I'm terrified every moment that I'm going to fail them, that my decisions will be the ones that finally break us. Without thinking, Ethan reached out and took her hand. She stiffened, then relaxed, her fingers curling around his. Her skin was calloused from work, warm despite the cold air. You're not going to fail them, Ethan said. Anyone who fights this hard doesn't know how to quit. Kaya's eyes glistened in the starlight. And are you a man who quits, or are you a man who stays? The question hung between them, an enormous and impossible. Ethan knew that whatever he said next would change everything for her, for the tribe, for himself. He thought about his life before, the endless, moving, the emptiness that had driven him deeper and deeper into isolation until he'd nearly died from it. He thought about the little girl in the corral, about Sahali's tired wisdom, about Nadi's justified hatred, about women who refused to give up even when the world had taken everything. About Kaya standing here in the dark, letting him see her fear, because she thought he might be someone worth trusting with it. I don't know yet, Ethan said honestly, but I'm not running tonight. Kaya's grip tightened on his hand. Then stay tonight, and tomorrow night, and the night after. Stay until you know. 3 days passed like pages turning in a book, written in a language Ethan was only beginning to understand. The first day had been about survival, his own as much as the tribe's. Every woman in the camp watched him with varying degrees of suspicion, hostility, or cautious curiosity. He was an unknown quantity, a disruption in the carefully balanced ecosystem they had created from the ashes of their former lives. Some, like Nadi, made no attempt to hide their distrust. Others, like the elder named Ison, who tended the camp's small garden of desert plants, simply observed him with the patience of someone who'd learned that time revealed truth more accurately than words. Ethan threw himself into the work with the desperate intensity of a man trying to prove his worth. There were fences to mend where recent winds had damaged the horse corral, and he worked with his hands in ways that felt familiar and centering. The physical labor was a gift after days of uncertainty and the surreal negotiation for his life. Each post straightened, each rail secured, was a small declaration of intent that he planned to be here long enough for the repairs to matter. The horses responded to him immediately. Animals always did. It was something about the way he moved around them, patient and confident without being dominating. These were Mustangs mostly captured from wild herds and gentled just enough to serve the tribe's needs. They were wary of strangers, but Ethan had a way of speaking to them in the universal language of calm presence and steady hands. You have the touch, observed Ayasha the healer as she watched him work with a particularly skittish mare. Her English was more heavily accented than Kaya's, but clear and thoughtful. Animals know the heart of a man before he knows it himself. What does she say about mine? Ethan asked, not entirely joking. Ayasha studied the mare who had relaxed under his touch and was allowing him to check her hooves for stones. She says you carry old pain, but not old anger. Pain can heal. Anger becomes poison if it sits too long in the heart. It was an astute observation from someone who barely knew him, but then healers learn to read more than just physical symptoms. Ethan found himself working near Ayasha, more often drawn to her gentle wisdom and the way she moved through the camp, bringing comfort to both people and animals. The second day brought deeper integration into the rhythms of tribal life. He learned that the women had established a rotation for various duties: hunting, cooking, maintenance, guard duty, childcare. Everyone contributed according to their abilities and circumstances. Sahali, despite her injured leg, supervised food preparation and storage with the attention to detail of someone who understood that waste could mean death. The younger women took turns on hunting expeditions, ranging out into the desert to track rabbits, deer, and the occasional javelina that provided protein for the camp. Ethan was assigned to work with Nate, a woman in her 30s who managed the camp's water resources. The desert was unforgiving to the careless, and water was life in a more immediate way than most people ever had to consider. She showed him the hidden springs they'd discovered in the rocks above camp, the carefully constructed channels that collected morning dew and rare rainwater, the storage systems that kept their supply clean and accessible. 3 years we have been here, Neat told him as they climbed to check on a catch basin carved into the stone. 3 years of learning that the desert gives to those who understand its gifts, but it kills those who try to take what it does not offer freely. She was testing him, Ethan realized. Not just his ability to do the work, but his willingness to learn from women, to accept instruction from people the outside world would dismiss as squaws or savages. It was a test he was determined to pass, not because he wanted to prove anything to them, but because he was beginning to understand that their knowledge was hard-won and precious. "How did you find this place?" he asked as they cleaned debris from a water channel. "Kaya led us here after the last raid," Neat replied. "She said the spirits showed her this valley in a vision. Some thought she was, what is your word? Desperate, making decisions from fear instead of wisdom." She paused in her work to look at him directly. "But the spirits do not lie to those who listen with true hearts. Kaya hears them clearly." It was the first time anyone had spoken to him about Kaya as anything other than a leader or captor. The reverence in Nate's voice was unmistakable, but it was the reverence due to someone who had earned respect through sacrifice and wisdom, not through inherited authority. Imala remained a constant presence on the periphery of his awareness. The little girl was everywhere and nowhere, appearing suddenly when he least expected it, watching him with those serious dark eyes that seemed too old for her face. She never spoke to him directly, but he began to notice small signs of her presence. A flower left near his bedroll, carefully arranged stones that might have been meaningless, or might have been a child's attempt at communication. On the afternoon of the second day, she followed him when he went to work on a shelter whose roof had been damaged by recent winds. She maintained her distance, maybe 20 feet away, but she stayed there as he worked, occasionally bringing him tools or materials without being asked. It was progress of a sort, the gradual erosion of fear through patient demonstration that not all men were dangerous. When he finished the repair, Ethan sat down in the shade and pulled out a piece of wood he'd been carving during quiet moments. Nothing elaborate, just a simple horse figure taking shape under his knife. Amala crept closer, drawn by curiosity, until she was close enough to see what he was making. "Do you like horses?" he asked quietly, not looking at her directly, not wanting to spook her with too much attention. She nodded, still maintaining her careful distance. "This one's special," Ethan continued, working carefully on the mane. "She's a spirit horse, the kind that runs so fast she can carry messages between the world of the living and the world of the ancestors." Imala's eyes widened. In Apache tradition, horses were sacred animals, bridges between the physical and spiritual worlds. By referencing their beliefs respectfully, Ethan was acknowledging not just her culture, but her right to that culture, her place as a keeper of stories and meanings that outsiders too often dismissed. When the carving was finished, he set it on the ground between them and backed away. "Spirit horses choose their own riders," he said. "Maybe she'll choose you." Amala approached slowly, reverently, and picked up the small wooden figure. For the first time since he'd arrived, she smiled, a quick, brilliant expression that transformed her serious face into something bright and young and hopeful. Then she was gone, running back to her mother with her treasure clutched in her small hands. Nadi had watched the entire interaction from her position near the fire pit, her scarred face unreadable. When Amala disappeared, she approached Ethan with the predatory grace of someone who'd learned that violence was sometimes the only language that worked. "You think small gifts will make us trust you?" she asked bluntly. "I think small kindnesses make the world a better place," Ethan replied honestly. "Whether they earn trust or not isn't really up to me." Nadi studied him for a long moment, her hand resting on the knife at her belt. "My husband carved toys for her, little animals, dolls from scraps of cloth. She was the light of his eyes, the daughter we never had ourselves." Her voice was steady, but Ethan could hear the old pain underneath it, like bedrock beneath soil. "The men who killed him made her watch, made us all watch. They said it would teach us what happened to women who thought they could live without male protection." The revelation hit Ethan like a physical blow. He'd assumed the raid had been about resources or territory, the kind of conflict that shaped life on the frontier. But this was something darker, a deliberate campaign to break the spirit of women who tried to live on their own terms. "I'm sorry," he said, knowing the words were inadequate, but needing to say them anyway. "Sorry doesn't bring back the dead," Nadi replied harshly. "But," she paused, seeming to struggle with something. "But you carve toys for a frightened child, not because you want something from her, but because you see her fear and want to ease it. My husband would have done the same thing." It was the closest thing to approval he'd gotten from her, and Ethan understood that it had cost her something to acknowledge it. Trust was a luxury these women couldn't afford to give easily, but they were watching for signs that he might be worthy of it eventually. In Kaya, she remained the center around which everything else orbited. She was everywhere and nowhere, simultaneously present and distant, watching him with an expression that flickered between hope and wariness like sunlight through moving water. Ethan caught glimpses of her throughout each day, consulting with the elders, organizing hunting parties, settling disputes with the quiet authority of someone who'd learned leadership through necessity rather than inheritance. They hadn't spoken privately since that night under the stars, but something had shifted between them. An awareness that hummed in the air when they were close, a recognition that decisions had been made that couldn't be unmade. When their eyes met across the camp during meals or work periods, there was an intimacy that had nothing to do with physical proximity and everything to do with two people who'd seen each other without masks in a moment of complete honesty. On the third day that carefully maintained distance finally broke. On the third day that carefully maintained distance finally broke. It started with a hunting party that went wrong. Elu, one of the younger women, had been tracking a small herd of deer that had been spotted near the eastern edge of their territory. She was skilled patient and knew the desert as well as anyone in the camp. But even the most skilled hunters could find themselves in situations that required more than individual ability. Elu's horse had stepped in a prairie dog hole, throwing her hard and landing on her leg in the process. By the time she managed to crawl back to camp, supported by the other members of the hunting party, her leg was clearly broken, and she was fading in and out of consciousness from blood loss and shock. Ayasha worked over the injured woman with the focused intensity of someone fighting to save a life, but her expression was grim. "The bone is broken badly," she told Kaya in English, probably for Ethan's benefit as much as to practice the language. "I can set it, but she needs medicine that grows only in the Sacred Valley 2 days' ride north. Without it, the bone will not heal properly and infection will set in." "I'll go," Kaya said immediately. "Take 4 women, ride hard, be back in 3 days. "No." Sahali's voice cut through the discussion with the authority of absolute knowledge. "The Sacred Valley is in disputed territory now. Mexican raiders have been seen in the area, and they are not friendly to Apache women traveling alone. You would be riding into danger for medicine that might not even be there anymore." The argument that followed was brief but intense, conducted in rapid Apache that Ethan could follow only partially. He understood enough to know that Kaya was determined to risk the journey. Sahali was equally determined to prevent it, and the other women were split between those who wanted to try anything that might save Alu and those who thought the risk was too great. "There's another option," Ethan said, quietly interrupting the debate. All eyes turned to him, and he felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing. He was still the outsider here, still the man whose place in their community was uncertain. Speaking up during a crisis was either exactly the right thing to do or exactly the wrong thing, and he wouldn't know which until after the words had left his mouth. I know the country north of here, he continued. Road patrol through there for 2 years when I was with the cavalry. I know where the Mexican raiders camp know, their patrol routes know how to avoid them. If the medicine is there, I can get it faster and safer than a large group. Alone. Kaya's voice carried a dozen different emotions. Surprise, concern, something that might have been fear at the thought of losing him just when she'd found him. Not alone, Ethan said, looking directly at her. With you. 2 riders move faster than 4, make less noise, leave smaller tracks. You know what we're looking for. I know how to get there alive. Together we might just pull it off. The silence stretched out long enough for him to wonder if he'd just volunteered for his own death sentence. Then Nadi spoke up from her position beside Alu's makeshift bed. He's right, she said grudgingly. 2 riders, if they're smart and lucky, might make it. More than that, and you're asking to be spotted and hunted down. Sahali was shaking her head. Too dangerous. If we lose you both. If we don't try, Elu dies for certain, Kaya interrupted. At least this gives her a chance. She looked at Ethan, and something passed between them. Not just agreement about tactics, but recognition of a shared willingness to risk everything for people they'd chosen to call family. We leave in 1 hour, Kaya decided. Pack, light, ride fast, trust the desert to hide us. The preparation was swift and efficient. Kaya changed into traveling clothes, practical leather, and cloth that would blend with the desert landscape and stand up to hard riding. She armed herself with her bow, a knife, and a rifle that looked well-maintained and familiar in her hands. Ethan checked his own weapons and the supplies they'd need for a journey that could take anywhere from 2 to 5 days depending on conditions and complications. As they prepared to leave, Amala appeared at Ethan's side, her small face serious as she looked up at him. In her hands, she held the wooden horse he'd carved for her, and after a moment of consideration, she held it out to him. For good medicine, she said in carefully pronounced English. It was the first time he'd heard her speak his language, and the trust implied in the gesture, giving back his gift, so it could protect him on a dangerous journey, hit him harder than any words could have. I'll bring it back to you, Ethan promised, tucking the small carving into his shirt pocket. And I'll bring back medicine for Alu. Imala nodded solemnly, then surprised him by reaching up and briefly touching his hand before running back to her mother. The ride north took them through landscape that shifted subtly from the familiar desert around their camp to terrain that was both more lush and more dangerous. They followed game trails and seasonal creek beds, staying off the established routes where they might encounter other travelers. Kaya rode with the fluid grace of someone who'd been born to the saddle, her body moving with her horse as if they were a single creature. She navigated by landmarks that were invisible to Ethan's eyes. A particular configuration of rocks, a tree shaped by years of prevailing winds, subtle changes in the color of soil that told stories about water and seasons, and the movement of animals. They didn't speak much during the first day's ride, conserving energy and maintaining the kind of awareness that kept travelers alive in disputed territory. But that evening, as they made a cold camp in a hidden canyon where a small spring provided water for their horses, the barriers that had separated them in camp began to dissolve. Tell me about the medicine, Ethan said as they shared a meal of dried meat and hard bread. What exactly are we looking for? Sacred willow, Kaya replied, her voice soft in the growing darkness. It grows only in places where underground water stays close to the surface year-round. The bark, when prepared properly, fights infection and reduces the fever that kills more people than broken bones. She paused, staring into the small fire they'd risked building in the shelter of overhanging rocks. My grandmother taught me to recognize it, to harvest it, to prepare it. She said it was a gift from the spirits for women who knew how to listen to the earth. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. She was. Kaya's voice carried the weight of loss and love combined. She was the one who taught me that leadership isn't about commanding others, it's about understanding what they need and finding ways to provide it. She said a true chief is like water always flowing toward where it's needed most, always taking the shape that serves the land. Ethan studied her face in the firelight, seeing past the careful composure to the woman underneath who'd been shaped by loss and responsibility in equal measure. Is that why you saved me? Because the tribe needed what I could provide? Kaya was quiet for a long moment, and when she answered, Her voice was almost too soft to hear. At first, yes, I saw a man alone in the desert, someone who might give us what we needed to survive. But now, she looked up, meeting his eyes directly. Now I think maybe I was the one who needed saving. The honesty in her voice was devastating in its simplicity. Here was a woman who'd carried impossible burdens for years, who'd made decisions that affected the survival of everyone she loved, who'd been strong for so long that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to lean on someone else. From what? Ethan asked gently. From becoming nothing but the role I have to play. From forgetting that I'm a woman, not just a chief. From believing that duty is the only thing that matters. She reached across the small space between them and touched his hand, her fingers warm and slightly trembling. You make me remember who I was before everything fell apart. Who I might still be if I'm brave enough to trima. Ethan turned his hand over, interlacing their fingers, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of her life in ways that words never could. You don't have to choose between being a leader and being yourself, Kaya. The best leaders are the ones who stay human. Even when being human means being afraid. Especially then, fear keeps you honest, keeps you from making decisions based on pride instead of wisdom. They sat in comfortable silence after that, hands linked, watching the fire burn down to coals, while the desert night settled around them like a familiar blanket. Somewhere in that silence, without words or dramatic declarations, something fundamental shifted between them. They stopped being captor and prisoner, stopped being desperate leader and potential solution, stopped being anything except two people who'd found something unexpected and precious in each other. When they bedded down for the night, it was side by side, sharing warmth and watch duty, in turns trusting each other with sleep and vulnerability in a way that spoke of bonds deeper than strategy or convenience. The second day brought them within sight of the sacred valley, and with it, the first real test of Ethan's knowledge of the terrain and the dangers it contained. The valley was hidden in a fold of red rock country, invisible from any direction except the narrow approach trail that wound between towering canyon walls. But getting there required passing through what Ethan knew to be Mexican raider territory. These weren't organized bandits who raided settlements for profit, but displaced soldiers from various failed revolutions who'd turned to hunting Apache families for the bounties that provincial governments still offered. There, he said quietly, pointing to a series of small dust clouds visible in the distance. 6 riders, maybe 8, moving in a search pattern. They're looking for something or someone. Kaya followed his gaze, her expression tightening. Us, maybe, or other travelers, but if they've spotted our tracks, he studied the terrain ahead. There's another way into the valley. Harder, but it'll keep us out of sight. The alternative route tested both horses and riders, requiring them to dismount and lead their animals through passages where the footing was treacherous and the drop fatal. But it worked. By late afternoon, they had reached the sacred valley without encountering the raiders. The valley was small, perhaps half a mile across, but it held impossible abundance. Springs bubbled up from underground sources, creating a network of streams that supported cottonwoods, willows, and dozens of plant species that had no business thriving in desert country. Birds sang in the branches, their voices carrying an almost musical quality. Even the light seemed different, softer, more golden. Now I understand, Ethan said softly, why your people call it sacred. Kaya smiled, the first truly unguarded expression he had seen from her. My grandmother used to say that the spirits concentrated all their love for the Apache people into this one valley so that no matter how hard the world became, we would always have proof that we were cherished. They found the sacred willow growing along the banks of the largest stream. The trees were ancient, their bark marked with scars of countless careful harvests by generations of healers. Kaya moved through the grove with reverence, speaking in Apache as she worked prayers of gratitude, asking permission rather than simply taking. That night, they made love under stars that seemed closer and brighter than they had any right to be. It was tender and desperate and perfect, two people finding in each other the missing pieces that made them whole. The return journey took 2 days, and they rode into camp to find that Alu had survived but was still fighting fever. Ayasha received the sacred willow bark with reverence and immediately began preparing the medicine. Within hours, Alu's fever broke. But their success brought unexpected consequences. Word had somehow reached other isolated groups, scattered Apache families, Mexican women fleeing violence, even white settlers caught on the wrong side of territorial disputes. One by one, small groups began appearing, drawn by stories of sanctuary. Kaya faced her most difficult leadership challenge: how to maintain security while responding to desperate need. "We can't save everyone," Sahali warned. "Our water can support maybe 30 people. Our hunting grounds will feed 30. More than that, and we risk everyone's survival." "But how do we choose who lives and who does?" asked Nita. "How do we look at children and tell their mothers there's no room?" Ethan listened to the debate with growing understanding of the complexity Kaya faced every day. "What if we don't have to choose?" he said finally. "What if instead of trying to house everyone here, we help them find other solutions?" The idea that took shape would transform their sanctuary from a single camp into the center of an informal network. Groups that couldn't be supported in the valley were helped to find other secure locations, provided with knowledge and tools that made independent survival possible. Ethan found himself taking on the role of liaison with the outside world, moving through hostile territories, negotiating with trading posts, gathering intelligence. His knowledge of the country and ability to pass as a wandering ex-soldier made him uniquely valuable. But the greatest transformation was in his relationship with the tribe. Gradually, he stopped being the outsider and became simply one of them, a member of the family whose presence had become essential. The change was most visible in Amala. The little girl who'd once flinched from his presence now sought him out regularly, chattering in a mixture of Apache and English about everything from new foals to old stories. One evening, as he taught her to carve simple shapes from soft wood, she looked up with those serious dark eyes and asked, "Will you be my father now?" Not instead of the father the spirits took away, but in addition to him, the question hit Ethan with unexpected force. "I would be honored," he said quietly, "if your mother agrees and if you're sure that's what you want." Amala nodded solemnly, then surprised him with a fierce hug that nearly knocked him over. On the fourth morning after their return, a rider approached camp. The attack came at dawn 2 weeks later, when the camp was just beginning to stir and the desert air still held night's coolness. Ethan woke to the sound of gunfire and women's voices raised in alarm. The peaceful rhythm of their daily life shattered in an instant. He rolled out of his bedroll and grabbed the rifle they'd returned to him, muscle memory from his cavalry days taking over before his mind fully processed what was happening. Outside, chaos ruled the camp. Women ran between buildings, some carrying weapons, others helping elders, and Imala reached cover behind the natural fortifications the rocks provided. "Raiders," Kaya called out, her voice cutting through the noise with the authority of someone accustomed to crisis. She'd emerged from her dwelling, fully armed, bow in hand, quiver across her back, every inch the warrior queen he'd first encountered in the desert. "Same ones who've been hunting us for months." Ethan could see them now, a dozen men on horseback circling the camp like wolves around wounded prey. But these weren't opportunistic bandits looking for easy plunder. They moved with military precision, their leader calling out orders with the voice of someone accustomed to command, someone who expected instant obedience from both his men and his enemies. "Captain Morrison's boys," Sahali said grimly, taking position behind a supply cache with her rifle. The weapon looked comfortable in her hands, and Ethan remembered that these women had been fighting for their lives for 3 years, long enough to become soldiers themselves, whether they'd wanted to or not. "They've been tracking us since spring." The name hit Ethan like a physical blow, recognition flooding through him with the force of unwelcome revelation. Morrison. He knew that name, knew the man behind it, with an intimacy that made his blood run cold. Captain No Colonel now James Morrison, his former commanding officer. The man whose orders Ethan had refused 2 years ago, walking away from his military career, rather than participate in what Morrison called pacification, and what any decent human being would recognize as systematic genocide. "Morrison," Ethan said, and something in his voice made Kaya look at him sharply, reading the history and pain written in his expression. "You know him. I used to serve under him. Before I... Ethan's jaw tightened as memories he'd tried to bury fought their way to the surface. "Before I decided I couldn't anymore." Understanding dawned in Kaya's eyes, followed immediately by something that might have been fear, or might have been recognition of cosmic irony. "What does he want with us?" Before Ethan could answer, Morrison's voice boomed across the camp, amplified by the natural acoustics of the rock formations that surrounded their hidden valley. It was a voice Ethan had heard delivering orders for 2 years, a voice that had once represented authority in military discipline, in the promise that following orders would lead to honor and purpose. "I know you're in there, Cross." The words echoed off stone walls like the pronouncement of some vengeful god. "2 years you've been running, but running time's over. Send out my daughter and maybe I won't burn this whole place to the ground." His daughter Ethan stared at Kaya, seeing her face go pale, seeing the truth written in her expression before she could hide it behind the mask of leadership she'd worn for so long. "Kaya Morrison," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Too many pieces were falling into place, explaining the careful ways she'd avoided talking about her past, the shadows that crossed her face when anyone mentioned the outside world. She closed her eyes, her shoulders sagging, as if a weight she'd been carrying finally became too heavy to bear. "I was hoping you'd never have to know. Your father is the man who ordered the massacre at Canyon de Chelly, the man who's been hunting these women for 3 years, trying to finish what he started." Kaya's voice was bitter as winter wind carrying years of accumulated pain and rage. "I ran away when I was 16, changed my name, found this tribe, built a new life, but he never stopped looking." Morrison's voice came again, closer now, heavy with the patience of someone who knew he held all the advantages. "You've got 5 minutes, Kaya. 5 minutes to come out peacefully, or I start sending your friends to whatever heathen afterlife they believe in." Around them, the women of the tribe took defensive positions with the calm efficiency of people who'd fought for survival before and knew exactly what they were facing. But Ethan could see the fear in their eyes, could read the mathematics of desperation written in the way they checked their weapons in calculated fields of fire. 18 women and 1 man, most of them armed with bows and knives, facing a dozen trained cavalry soldiers with rifles and military tactics. The odds were bad. The odds were terrible. "There's another way," Kaya said suddenly, and Ethan saw something desperate forming in her expression. "If I surrender—" "No." The word came out sharper than Ethan intended, carrying with it all the authority he'd learned during his years as an officer. "You're not sacrificing yourself for what? For them? They're my responsibility, Ethan. My people. If my death saves their lives, it won't." Ethan grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him to see the certainty in his eyes. "Men like Morrison don't leave witnesses. You know that. You surrender, he kills you, and then kills everyone else anyway, just to be thorough." The truth of it settled over them like a shroud. There would be no negotiation, no mercy, no walking away from this confrontation. Morrison had found what he'd been looking for, and he wouldn't leave without finishing what he'd started 3 years ago. "Then what do you suggest?" Kaya asked, her voice steady, despite the impossible situation they faced. Ethan looked around the camp at the defensive positions that could become death traps, at the rock formations that could provide cover or concealment, at the women who'd welcomed him, and the little girl whose laughter had become something precious to protect. He thought about Morrison's weaknesses, about the pride that had always been the man's fatal flaw, about military tactics that might work against someone who thought he was hunting helpless victims. "We fight," he said, "and we make sure it costs him everything." The battle began with Morrison's ultimatum expiring in gunfire. The first shot came from one of his troopers, an impatient soldier who decided that 5 minutes was too long to wait for surrender that wasn't coming. The bullet chipped stone near Sahali's position, and suddenly the morning exploded into chaos that had been building for 3 years. Ethan had fought in cavalry charges and infantry assaults, had seen men die in battles that stretched across miles of disputed territory. But this was different. This wasn't war between armies organized around abstract principles. This was survival. Personal and desperate and intimate in the way that fighting for home always was. The women of Kaya's tribe fought like demons, unleashed from whatever hell housed the spirits of the dispossessed and the desperate. They used every advantage the terrain offered, every trick that 3 years of being hunted had taught them, every lesson learned from watching their families die to superior firepower and tactics. Arrows flew from unexpected angles, striking targets and disappearing back into cover before return fire could locate the shooter. Nadi moved through the battle with lethal grace, her bow singing a song of vengeance for the husband and brother she'd lost to men exactly like these. When a trooper tried to flank their position, she put an arrow through his shoulder without seeming to aim muscle memory, and rage combining into something that transcended conscious thought. "Not bad for a man," she called out in English, reloading with practiced efficiency while bullets whined overhead. "Not bad for someone who wanted to kill me," Ethan called back, taking down another soldier with his rifle, settling into the familiar rhythm of combat that his body remembered even when his mind tried to forget. Nadi actually smiled a fierce predatory expression that promised death to anyone who threatened her chosen family. I changed my mind. You're useful. But useful wasn't enough, and they all knew it. They were being pushed back, forced into a tighter and tighter defensive circle as Morrison's men advanced with the inexorable pressure of professional soldiers who understood how to use superior numbers and firepower. Sahali took a bullet in the leg and had to be dragged to cover her face gray with pain, but her hands still steady on her weapon. One of the younger women, Ayana, barely 18, fell to a rifle shot that took her down instantly, her blood darkening the sand as her sisters fought on around her body. And through it all, Morrison's voice carried over the gunfire, calling out to his daughter with the terrible patience of someone who knew he was winning. This can all stop, Kaya. Just walk away from these savages and come home. Your mother misses you. Kaya's response was to put an arrow through the hat of the trooper nearest her father, the shaft passing so close to the man's head that he dove for cover with undignified haste. The message was clear enough, but the tide of battle was turning against them with mathematical certainty. Ethan could feel it in the rhythm of gunfire, in the way the women's positions kept shifting backward, always backward toward the center of camp, where there was nowhere left to retreat. That was when Amala appeared. The little girl had been in the safest part of the camp with the other non-combatants, protected by older women whose fighting days were behind them, but whose courage had never been in question. But somehow she'd slipped away from her guardians, emerging from behind a storage cache, just as one of Morrison's men was advancing on Sahali's position, with his rifle raised to finish the wounded elder. The trooper saw the child and hesitated just for a moment, but long enough for something extraordinary to happen that would be talked about around fires for generations to come. Imala, who'd been terrified of men since the day she was born, who flinched whenever Ethan moved too quickly, despite months of patient trust building, stepped directly between the soldier and Sahali. Her small body was straight and defiant, her dark eyes blazing with the kind of courage that only came from protecting family, from understanding that some things were worth more than safety. No, she said in clear English, not the first word she'd spoken in his language, but the most important. No hurt, grandmother. The trooper stared at her, his weapon wavering, the simple human decency that existed somewhere beneath his military training fought against orders and habit in the momentum of violence. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the battle seemed to pause around them, as if the desert itself was holding its breath to see what choice would be made. Then Morrison's voice cut through the moment like a blade honed on cruelty and shaped by years of dehumanizing everyone who didn't share his skin color or his vision of manifest destiny. Shoot the brat, Miller. She's one of them. Miller's rifle started to rise, training in obedience, overriding whatever human impulse had made him hesitate. Imala stood her ground, all 6 years of her facing down death, with the kind of bravery that legends were built on and heroes remembered for. Ethan's rifle spoke first. Miller went down hard, his weapon discharging harmlessly into the air as he tumbled backward into the sand that would drink his blood and remember nothing of his name or the choices that had brought him to this place of final reckoning. Something in the sound of that shot seemed to break Morrison's professional composure, like a dam failing under pressure too long sustained. His voice rose to a roar of genuine rage, the careful control of a military officer replaced by the fury of a father whose authority had been challenged too many times by children who refused to understand their place in his vision of proper order. Enough, burn them out. I want this place turned to ash. The order changed everything in ways that went far beyond tactics or strategy. Morrison's men stopped trying to capture and started trying to destroy, producing torches and kerosene that they'd brought for exactly this purpose, beginning to set fire to the dwellings and storage areas and everything else that would burn. Smoke began to rise thick and black against the morning sky, carrying with it the smell of 3 years' worth of careful building and patient accumulation reduced to nothing. Kaya peered at Ethan's side, her face streaked with soot and determination. Blood from a shallow cut above her eye mixing with tears she refused to shed while there was still fighting to be done. We have to get them out of here, she said, her voice carrying the weight of leadership even in the face of total defeat. All of them, before the smoke gets too thick to breathe. Where? Ethan asked, reloading his rifle while scanning the battlefield for Morrison's position. There's nowhere to run that he won't follow. There is one place. Kaya's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of terrible decision. The sacred caves in the rocks above us. Morrison's men won't follow us there. Why not? Kaya met his eyes, and Ethan saw the depth of what she was asking him to accept the choice between certain death and possible survival that might be worse than death. Because the cave has two entrances, and if we bring the roof down on the back entrance after we're inside, the implication hit him like cold water thrown in his face. We'd be trapped. We'd be safe for a while, long enough for Morrison to decide we're dead and move on to easier prey. Kaya's jaw tightened with the resolve of someone who'd run out of good options and had to choose among the terrible ones. It's a risk, but it's better than watching everyone burn. Ethan looked around the battle that was rapidly becoming a massacre. At Sahali bleeding but still fighting. At Nadi protecting Amala with maternal instincts that had been forged in loss and tempered by determination. At all the women who'd welcomed him into their impossible family and made him understand what it meant to have something worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth living for. Tell them to move, he said. I'll cover the retreat. Not alone, Kaya said firmly. We do this together or we don't do it at all. The fighting withdrawal to the caves was a nightmare written in smoke and gunfire and desperate courage. The women moved in stages, covering each other, carrying their wounded, making sure no one was left behind. Because that was what family meant, that nobody faced the darkness alone, that every life mattered enough to risk everything else. Morrison's men pressed their advantage, but the terrain worked against them as they climbed, and the defenders knew every rock and shadow and hiding place that 3 years of careful exploration had revealed. Halfway up the cliff face, Ethan felt a bullet crease his shoulder, spinning him around, and nearly sending him tumbling back down the rocks toward certain death. Kaya was there instantly, her arm around his waist, helping him keep his footing, while blood soaked through his shirt and the world spun with pain and adrenaline. I'm fine, he gasped, though they both knew he wasn't. You're alive, she said, and her voice carried relief that it hadn't been worse, mixed with fear of how much worse it could still become. That's what matters. They reached the cave entrance as the last of Morrison's men fell back, discouraged by the difficulty of the climb and the accuracy of covering fire from defenders who were fighting for everything they had ever cared about. The cave was larger than Ethan had expected, a natural cathedral carved from red sandstone by millions of years of water and wind, with smooth walls and a ceiling that disappeared into shadow. The women filed in 18 survivors, carrying their wounded and their hope and their determination to see another dawn. Imala clung to her mother's hand, but when she saw Ethan, she broke free and ran to him, her small arms wrapping around his waist in the kind of trust that made promises and demanded keeping them. Thank you, she whispered against his shirt, her voice muffled but clear. Thank you for protecting us. Ethan's throat tightened as he looked down at this brave little girl, this child who'd faced down death to protect her family and somehow found room in her heart to worry about his safety. Always, he said, his hand resting gently on her head. I'll always protect you. Kaya was working with Sahali and 2 other women to prepare the charges that would bring down the cave entrance, sealing them inside with black powder they'd saved from their raiding days, and the knowledge to use it that survival had forced them to acquire. But once they triggered the collapse, there would be no going back, no changing their minds, no second chances. How long can we survive in here? Ethan asked, his medical training making him catalog their resources, even as his heart tried to process the magnitude of what they were choosing. Water for a week, maybe 10 days if we're careful, Sahali said, wrapping her wounded leg with strips of cloth torn from someone's spare clothing. Food for less. But Morrison won't wait that long. He'll assume we're dead after a few days and move on to easier prey. And then we dig ourselves out and start over. Again. The resignation in her voice was heartbreaking, carrying the weight of 3 years spent building and losing and building again, always one step ahead of men who wanted to erase them from the earth as if they'd never existed. These women had learned that survival meant accepting that nothing was permanent, that home was something you carried with you, rather than something you could establish in any particular place. But maybe this time could be different. What if he didn't move on? Ethan asked, suddenly, an idea forming that was either brilliant or completely insane, but probably both. What if, instead of assuming we're dead, he decided to wait us out? Kaya looked up from her work with the explosives, her face grave with the understanding of what he was suggesting. Then we die in here, slow and certain. Or, Ethan said, the plan taking shape as he spoke, We make sure he has bigger problems to worry about. He explained his idea quickly, watching their faces change as they understood what he was proposing. It was dangerous more than dangerous. It was nearly suicidal. But it was also the kind of bold stroke that could end Morrison's threat permanently, that could give these women the peace they'd been fighting for since the day their world first fell apart. "You're talking about going back down there," Nadi said flatly, her scarred face set in lines of grim understanding. "Alone, against a dozen trained soldiers." "Not alone," Ethan corrected, "and not against all of them. Morrison's weakness has always been his pride. He can't resist a challenge to his authority, especially from someone he considers a traitor to everything he stands for." Kaya was shaking her head before he finished speaking. "No, absolutely not. I won't let you—" "It's not your choice to make," Ethan said gently, his voice carrying the love and certainty that had grown between them like something planted in good soil and tended with care. "I'm not doing this because you're asking me to. I'm doing it because it's right. Because someone has to make the choice to end this cycle, and I choose to be that someone." The argument that followed was brief but intense, conducted in whispers, because sound carried in confined spaces, and Morrison's men might still be within earshot. Kaya used every rational argument, every emotional appeal, every tool of persuasion she possessed to change his mind. But in the end, they all knew the mathematics of survival. Morrison wouldn't give up. He'd keep hunting, keep pressing, keep trying to finish what he'd started, until either he was dead or they were. Someone had to break the cycle. "If you don't come back," Kaya started, her voice breaking with the weight of possibilities too terrible to name. "Then you rebuild," Ethan said firmly, his hands framing her face, his thumbs wiping away tears that tracked through the dust and smoke on her cheeks. "You take these women and you find another place and you build something beautiful. You make sure Amala has children of her own someday, and you tell them about the people who chose to fight instead of surrender." Kaya's eyes filled with fresh tears, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "And if you do come back—" Ethan smiled, the expression feeling strange after so much violence and loss, but absolutely right in this moment, in this place, with this woman who had saved his life by capturing it and then set him free to choose what kind of man he wanted to be. "Then we start planning our wedding." When their lips met, it was with the desperation of people who knew that this might be their last moment together, but also with the certainty of love that had been tested by impossible circumstances and found to be unbreakable. The kiss was everything: goodbye and promise, fear and hope, the taste of tears and the salt of sweat, and the copper tang of blood from wounds that would heal, or wouldn't, but mattered less than this connection between two souls who'd found each other in the middle of a war. "I love you," Kaya whispered against his mouth, speaking words that neither of them had dared to say before because saying them made the risk of loss too real to bear. "I love you too," Ethan replied, memorizing the feel of her in his arms, the scent of sage and smoke in her hair, the way her heart beat against his chest in rhythm with his own. "Whatever happens, remember that. I choose this. I choose you. I choose them. Not because I have to, but because I want to." The descent from the cave was like walking backward through time, leaving safety and love, and the promise of a future to face ghosts from a past he'd tried to escape. But as Ethan made his way down the cliff, Vidish using handholds and ledges that the morning's battle had made familiar, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the absolute certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be doing exactly what he was meant to do. Morrison's men had made camp in the ruins of the tribal settlement, confident that their quarry was trapped above them with nowhere to run. They'd posted sentries, but their attention was focused on the cave entrance, watching for any sign of movement from the women they assumed were slowly dying of thirst and despair in the darkness. They weren't expecting someone to come down behind them. Ethan had spent his years in the cavalry, learning how to move silently through hostile territory, how to read the patterns of guards and the weaknesses of defensive positions, how to become invisible when invisibility meant the difference between mission success and death in some godforsaken valley that would never appear on any official map. Those skills served him well now, as he ghosted between shadows, using every piece of cover the familiar terrain offered, until he was close enough to hear Morrison's voice giving orders to subordinates who'd learned not to question the colonel's methods, no matter how brutal they seemed. "Johnson, take 3 men and check the back side of these rocks. Make sure there is no other way out of that cave. Miller's dead because we got careless, and I don't intend to lose anyone else to these savages. Yes, sir. What about the girl? What about her? Morrison's voice was cold as winter stone, carrying the kind of indifference that came from years of reducing human beings to tactical problems to be solved. She made her choice when she ran away from civilization. When this is over, she's just another casualty of necessary war. Ethan felt rage build in his chest at the casual dismissal of Kaya's life, at the way Morrison spoke about his own daughter, as if she were nothing more than a military objective to be achieved or discarded depending on convenience. But he forced the anger down, channeled it into focus and determination, rather than letting it make him careless, when carelessness would get everyone killed. He waited until Johnson and his men moved off to scout the rocks, then made his move with the patient precision of someone who understood that he would only get one chance to do this right. The first sentry never knew what hit him. Ethan's knife took him quietly efficiently, the way they'd taught him in the special units that handled missions too sensitive for regular troops to know about. The man's rifle, a Winchester repeater, with a full magazine and a telescopic sight that would have cost a month's military pay, was the next piece of the puzzle. The second sentry was more alert, head-turning at some small sound that might have been wind through rocks or might have been something else. But Ethan had the advantage of knowing the terrain intimately, of understanding exactly where shadows fell and how sound carried in this particular configuration of stone and sand. A thrown pebble created a distraction in one direction, and when the soldier turned to investigate, Ethan was behind him with the knife. 2 down, 10 to go. And now came the dangerous part. Morrison was standing near the central fire, studying a map spread out on a wooden crate with the kind of focused attention that had made him an effective military commander before power and prejudice had twisted him into something monstrous. Even at 55, he was an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that commanded rooms and battlefields alike. His hair had gone mostly gray, but his eyes were the same pale blue Ethan remembered, cold and calculating as a winter sky. "Evening, Colonel," Ethan called out, stepping into the firelight with the rifle held casually in his hands, as if this were a social call rather than a confrontation that had been building for 2 years. Morrison spun around his hand, going automatically to the sidearm at his hip, but he stopped when he saw who'd spoken. A smile spread across his weathered face, not pleasant but satisfied, like a man who'd been waiting a long time for this moment and was finally going to get the resolution he had been denied. "Ethan Cross, I wondered when you'd stop running and face me like a man." "I'm not running anymore," Ethan said, his voice carrying the kind of calm certainty that came from knowing exactly what was at stake and exactly what he was willing to sacrifice to protect it. "Question is, are you going to finish this between us, or do you need your boys to hold your hand?" The insult hit its mark with mathematical precision. Morrison's jaw tightened, and Ethan saw the flash of the temper that had always been the man's fatal weakness, the pride that made him predictable in ways that could be exploited by someone who understood his nature. The colonel had built his reputation on personal courage and individual skill, and the suggestion that he might hide behind his men was exactly the kind of challenge he couldn't ignore, no matter how tactically sound it would have been. "Stand down," Morrison called to his remaining soldiers, who'd started to move toward Ethan with the automatic response of men trained to protect their commanding officer. "This is between Cross and me. Personal business." "Sir," one of them protested, uncertainty clear in his voice. "He's armed." "So am I." Morrison's hand rested on his pistol, but he made no move to draw at it, yet savoring the moment in the way of someone who'd been denied this satisfaction for too long. "Back off, all of you. Give us room to settle this properly." The soldiers reluctantly complied, forming a loose circle around the two men, but keeping their distance, understanding that they were witnessing something that went deeper than military duty or territorial conflict. This was personal in the way that only broken trust and moral betrayal could make things personal. So far, Morrison's pride was making him predictable, exactly as Ethan had hoped. "You always were too clever for your own good, Cross," Morrison said conversationally, his voice carrying the kind of casual menace that came from absolute confidence in his own superiority. "Using my own nature against me. I suppose you think this makes you some kind of tactical genius." "I think this makes me a man who knows you," Ethan replied, keeping his own voice level and matter of fact. You can't resist a fair fight even when it's stupid, even when you should just order your men to shoot me where I stand." Morrison laughed a sound with no humor in it, sharp and bitter as alkali water. "Oh, but where would be the satisfaction in that? I've been hunting you for 2 years, Ethan. 2 years of wondering where you went, what hole you crawled into after you betrayed everything we stood for, everything we'd fought to build." His expression hardened, revealing the fanatic underneath the professional soldier. "I want to look you in the eyes when you die. I want you to understand exactly what your weakness cost you." Betrayed, Ethan's voice carried genuine incredulity, the kind of amazement that came from hearing familiar words twisted into shapes that made no sense. "I refuse to massacre innocent people. That's not betrayal, James. That's called having a conscience." Innocent. Morrison's composure cracked slightly, revealing the depth of the delusion that had been growing in him like cancer for years. "There are no innocent savages, Cross. Only ones who haven't killed white children yet. What I ordered at Canyon de Chelly was necessary. What I'm doing here is necessary. And what I'm going to do to you—" He paused, his hand moving closer to his weapon. "That's going to be extremely necessary." The colonel's hand moved to his gun, but he still didn't draw, still playing out the theater of justification and moral superiority that he needed to maintain his self-image. This was as much about convincing himself as it was about killing the man who challenged his authority. "You know what your problem always was, Ethan? You were weak, sentimental. You looked at animals and saw people when any fool could tell the difference." "The only animal I see here is standing in front of me," Ethan said quietly, letting the truth of it ring in his voice like a bell tolling. That did it. Morrison's face flushed red, his control finally snapping completely under the weight of having his self-deception challenged so directly. "Draw, you son of a bitch!" Both men moved at the same time, hands flashing to weapons with the speed that came from long practice and desperate need, and the knowledge that only one of them would walk away from this moment. Morrison was faster than a man his age had any right to be, his pistol clearing leather and rising with the professional smoothness of someone who'd survived dozens of similar confrontations. But Ethan was faster. The Winchester spoke once, a sharp crack that echoed off the surrounding rocks like thunder in a clear sky. Morrison jerked backward, his pistol discharging harmlessly into the air as the bullet took him center mass, his eyes wide with something that might have been surprise or might have been the first dawning of understanding that his vision of manifest destiny was about to end in the sand of a nameless valley. He looked down at the spreading stain on his chest, then back up at Ethan, his expression shifting through confusion and realization before settling into something like respect. "Well," Morrison said, his voice already growing weaker as blood filled his lungs, "that was unexpected." He sat down heavily on the wooden crate, his hand pressed to his chest, blood seeping between his fingers in a rhythm that matched his failing heartbeat. Around them, his men stood frozen, uncertain what to do now that their commanding officer was dying and their primary mission had just become impossible to complete. "Listen to me," Morrison said, his voice carrying, despite its weakness, drawing on reserves of authority that ran deeper than physical strength. He was addressing his soldiers now, not Ethan giving final orders with the last breath he had left. "You boys, you head back to the fort. Tell them the renegades are dead. Tell them we got them all." "Sir," one of the troopers asked, confusion evident in his voice as he tried to understand what was being asked of him. What about nothing?" Morrison's glare still carried authority even as his life bled out onto the sand. "You follow orders, soldier. My last order is that you report mission accomplished and never speak of this place again. Is that understood?" The soldiers looked at each other, then back at their dying commander, the weight of what he was asking settling over them like a blanket. Slowly, reluctantly, they nodded their acceptance. Morrison turned his attention back to Ethan, his pale eyes focusing with visible effort. "She's really my daughter." "Yes. And she's happy with these people." Ethan thought about Kaya's smile when she'd welcomed him home, about the way she fought for her adopted family, with everything she had, about the love and responsibility that drove every decision she made. "She's found her purpose," he said honestly. "She's become the leader she was meant to be." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, his breathing growing more labored with each passing second. When he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper, carrying the weight of a lifetime's worth of regret condensed into final words. Tell her? Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I never should have tried to make her into something she wasn't. He coughed, blood specking his lips. Tell her I hope she's happy. I will. Morrison nodded once, then closed his eyes. A few minutes later, the only sound in the camp was the crackling of the fire and the quiet breathing of men who were trying to process what they'd just witnessed. The soldiers didn't try to arrest Ethan or avenge their commander. They were career military men who'd been given their orders by a dying officer, and they followed those orders with the discipline that had been drilled into them since the day they'd first put on the uniform. They broke camp, efficiently loaded Morrison's body onto one of their horses and rode east without looking back, carrying with them the official story that would ensure no one else came looking for the women in the hidden valley. Ethan watched them go, then began the slow climb back up to the cave where his family was waiting. The reunion was everything he could have hoped for and more. Kaya threw herself into his arms with such force that she nearly knocked him over, despite his wounded shoulder tears streaming down her face as she held him tight enough to bruise, as if physical contact could somehow guarantee that he was real and alive and had come back to her. Around them, the other women emerged from the shadows of the cave with expressions of relief and worry, and something approaching awe. They'd heard the single gunshot, had waited through hours of terrible silence, had begun to prepare themselves for the possibility that they were truly alone now in a world that seemed determined to erase them. Imala was the last to approach, her small face serious as she studied him with those dark eyes that seemed older than her years. Are the bad men gone? Yes, Ethan said, crouching down to meet her gaze directly. They're gone, and they're not coming back. Promise. Promise, Monsieur. She nodded solemnly, accepting his word with the absolute trust that children reserve for the adults they felt safest with. Then she surprised him by throwing her arms around his neck, her small body warm and solid against his chest. I'm glad you're my papa now, she whispered into his ear. The words hit Ethan harder than Morrison's bullet ever could have, filling spaces in his heart that he hadn't even realized were empty. He looked up at Kaya, seeing his own emotion reflected in her eyes, seeing the future they could build together, written in her smile. So am I, little one, he said, his voice rough with feeling. So am I. The ceremony took place 3 days later, when the smoke had cleared and the camp had been restored to something resembling normal. They held it at sunset, when the desert light turned everything golden and the air carried the scent of sage and possibility. Sahali performed the ritual, speaking words in the old language about continuity and survival and the courage required to start again after everything had been lost. She tied a woven cord around Ethan and Kaya's joined hands, the fiber rough against their skin, but solid, real, binding them to this moment, in this choice, in this commitment to build something lasting together. Kaya spoke her vows in English, so Ethan would understand every word. I accept you as partner, as equal, as the one who will stand with me in rebuilding what was broken. Not as property, not as prisoner, but as family. Ethan's voice was steady when he responded, carrying the certainty that came from knowing exactly what he was choosing and why. I choose this life, these people, this future. Not because I was forced, but because I was lost and you showed me where I belonged. When Sahali untied the cord, the tribe erupted in ululation, a sound of celebration that echoed off the rock formations surrounding their hidden valley, carrying joy and hope, and the promise of new beginnings into the desert air. Women who'd watched Ethan with suspicion now approached with acceptance, touching his shoulder, offering words in their language that he was beginning to understand meant welcome and blessing and the kind of belonging that went deeper than blood. Even Nadi came forward. She didn't smile, but the hatred had left her eyes, completely replaced by something that might have been approval, or might have been the recognition that he'd proven himself worthy of the trust they'd placed in him. Prove worthy of her, she said in her careful English, the words carrying the weight of a test that would last for the rest of his life. That's all I ask. Every day, Ethan promised, meaning it with every fiber of his being, for as long as I live. The celebration continued through the morning, food appearing from carefully hoarded supplies, and for once the women allowed themselves joy instead of just grim survival. Children from the other groups that had joined them played together in the central area, their laughter echoing off stone walls that had become accustomed to more serious sounds. Later, when the sun climbed high and the camp returned to its daily rhythms, Kaya led Ethan to her dwelling now. Their dwelling, a space that would be shared and shaped by both of them. Inside, it was simple but carefully maintained, filled with the accumulated treasures of a life lived deliberately, blankets woven with intricate patterns that told stories, storage baskets containing personal items that held memories, a space that had been hers alone, but was now offered freely to the man she'd chosen to build a future with. They sat together in the cool shade shoulders, touching fingers intertwined, no rush or pressure or sense of obligation. Just two people who'd found each other in impossible circumstances and decided that impossible was worth fighting for, worth building on. Worth the daily choice to love someone enough to share not just passion, but dreams, fears, hopes, and the ordinary miracles that made life meaningful. What happens now? Ethan asked, thinking about the challenges they still faced, the world outside their valley that remained dangerous, the work required to build something lasting from the foundation they'd laid. Kaya leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice carrying contentment and determination in equal measure. Now we live, we build, we hope. She paused, her free hand moving to rest over her still flat stomach. And when the time comes, when we're ready, we give this tribe the future they've been waiting for. A child, a beginning, Kaya corrected, her voice warm with possibility. The first of many, if the spirits are kind. Not just from us, you being here, choosing us, it shows the other women that maybe there are men worth trusting. Maybe we can find others carefully, slowly. But the possibility exists now where it didn't before. Ethan understood what she meant. He wasn't just Kaya's partner. He was proof that the tribe could survive contact with the outside world without losing themselves, evidence that love was possible even after betrayal and loss, a bridge between what they'd been and what they might become. Months would pass before Kaya told him she was carrying his child, her hand guiding his to feel the first flutter of movement that would become a daughter, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn determination to protect the things he loved. Almost a year before that child, Isabel, named for strength and promise, took her first breath in this hidden valley, surrounded by women who understood that every new life was a victory against all the forces that conspired to erase them from existence. But that was future. That was hope made flesh, dreams transformed into breathing, laughing, crying reality that would carry forward the legacy of everyone who died to make it possible. In this moment, Ethan Cross sat with his wife, his partner, his equal, his chosen family, the woman who'd saved his life by capturing it and then set him free to become the man he was meant to be. He felt something he'd never experienced before, the deep, bone-level satisfaction of being exactly where he belonged, with exactly the right people, building exactly the kind of life that made all the pain and loss and struggle worthwhile. The desert had taken everything from him, stripped him down to nothing, forced him to confront who he really was, when all the comfortable lies fell away, when rank and uniform and the illusion of civilization were burned away by sun and wind and the brutal honesty of survival. But in taking everything, it had also given him the greatest gift possible, the chance to choose freely and completely what kind of man he wanted to be and what kind of life he wanted to build. He'd gotten lost in the desert and found a tribe that needed him. But the truth was simpler and more profound than that. They needed each other, and that mutual need had grown into mutual love, mutual respect, mutual commitment to something larger than any individual life. That love had become the foundation for something that could last beyond any individual lifetime. A community built on choice rather than blood, on shared values rather than shared history, on the revolutionary idea that family was something you created rather than something you inherited. Years would pass. Isabel would grow strong and wise, learning to speak 3 languages. Apache for the stories of her people, English for the world she'd have to navigate, and Spanish for the traders and travelers who brought news from the outside. She would have brothers and sisters as other children were born to the community, as new families found their way to the hidden valley, as the network of connected settlements grew into something that resembled a nation within a nation. Imala would grow into a young woman of extraordinary courage and wisdom, becoming a bridge between the old ways and the new, between the traditions of her people and the innovations required for survival in a changing world. She would marry a young Mexican man whose family had fled violence south of the border, and their children would carry forward the mixed heritage that had become the strength of their community: Apache resilience, Mexican adaptability, and the fierce independence that characterized everyone who chose to make their home in the hidden places between the maps. Nadi would eventually find love again with a former soldier, much like Ethan, a man who'd walked away from a war that demanded too much of his conscience, who'd found his way to their valley carrying wounds that only time and patient hands could heal. She would teach him that trust was possible, even after betrayal, that families could be rebuilt even after destruction, that the heart was stronger than any force that tried to break it. Sahali would live to see her great-grandchildren born in freedom, would teach them the old stories, and the new ones would help them understand that they carried the dreams of countless ancestors who'd fought and contended for the simple right to exist, to love, to raise children who could laugh without fear. On her deathbed, surrounded by 3 generations of people she'd helped to raise, she would smile and say that she'd lived long enough to see the impossible become real, the dream become flesh, the hope become a living community that would outlast any individual life. And Kaya would become the leader she was always meant to be, not through the accident of birth or the weight of tradition, but through the conscious choice to serve something larger than herself. Under her guidance, the Hidden Valley would transform from a sanctuary for the desperate into a model for what communities could become when they chose cooperation over competition, when they valued every life regardless of origin, when they understood that strength came not from walls and weapons, but from the bonds between people who'd chosen to stand together against whatever forces tried to tear them apart. The network of allied settlements would grow, carefully, secretly connected by relationships of mutual aid and shared commitment to values that the official governments of both Mexico and the United States would have found deeply threatening. They would develop new forms of governance that honored both individual freedom and collective responsibility, new ways of sharing resources that ensured no one went hungry, while no one accumulated wealth at the expense of others' suffering. They would become a haven for people fleeing violence and oppression, runaway slaves and their descendants, Mexican families displaced by revolution, Native Americans escaping the horrors of the reservation system, white settlers whose consciences couldn't tolerate the brutality required for manifest destiny. Each new arrival would bring their own skills, their own stories, their own contributions to a community that grew stronger through diversity rather than weaker through division. There would be challenges, of course, years when the rains failed and water became precious beyond measure, conflicts with authorities who discovered pieces of their network and tried to crush what they couldn't control. Internal disagreements about how to balance the needs of security with the demands of growth, how to maintain their values while adapting to a world that seemed determined to change them. But they would survive all of it, not because they were stronger or smarter or more deserving than the communities that failed, but because they'd learned the fundamental lesson that the desert taught to everyone who listened carefully enough. Survival was never about individual strength or superiority, but about understanding your place in the larger web of relationships that connected all living things. Ethan would live to see his children grown and his grandchildren born, would train young men in the skills of survival and diplomacy that kept their community safe, would serve as ambassador to the outside world when negotiations were required, with powers that might otherwise see them only as threats to be eliminated. He would carry the scars of his shoulder wound for the rest of his life, but would consider it a small price to pay for the privilege of growing old, surrounded by people he loved, in a place where every sunrise brought the possibility of joy rather than the certainty of struggle. On quiet evenings when the work was done and the children were asleep and the stars painted patterns across the desert sky, he would sit with Kaya and remember the man he'd been before the desert stripped him down to his essential self. That man seemed like a stranger, now lost in ways that had nothing to do with geography, broken in ways that had nothing to do with physical wounds, searching for meaning in all the wrong places. The desert had taught him that getting lost was sometimes the first step toward finding yourself, that dying to who you thought you were was sometimes necessary for becoming who you were meant to be, that salvation often came wearing the face of the last person you expected to save you, and that love, real love, the kind that lasted and grew and transformed everyone it touched, was always a choice, never an accident. A daily decision to see the best in someone else, to fight for their happiness as fiercely as you fought for your own, to build something together that neither of you could have created alone. The desert's last daughter had found her home. The lost cavalry officer had found his purpose. And together they'd proven that sometimes the most beautiful flowers grew in the most unlikely soil, watered by tears and tended by hands, that refused to give up hope even when hope seemed like the most dangerous luxury of all. And that was enough to build a future on. That was enough to build a world on. That was enough. If you enjoyed this epic tale of survival love and second chances in the harsh Arizona desert, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible stories from the frontier. Your support helps us continue bringing you these cinematic adventures where courage meets destiny and hearts find their way home against impossible odds. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We'll see you in the next story.